Leon Flynn, for those of you who don't know, and I'm the acting director here at the Seamus Heaney Centre, while Glenn Patterson, who is the real director, is on sabbatical. So I'd just like to welcome you all here on behalf of the Centre to tonight's event, a conversation between Mark Carruthers and Professor Nicholas Allen to launch Nicholas Allen's book, Lough Neagh, which we have for sale here. This is in partnership with Irish Studies, so I don't have anything else left to do now apart from hand over to Peter Gray from Irish Studies. And I just say on top of that, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So Peter would.
Very much, Leoncha. Thank you all for coming. My name is Peter Graham, the Director of Irish Studies here in Queen's, and we're really grateful to the Seamus Heaney Centre for hosting jointly this wonderful event today to celebrate the publication of Nick Allen's new book, Lough Neagh. Just in case people have missed it, there are copies for sale over in the corner of the room there. So if you don't have a copy already, you can get one later on. So my role really is to introduce today's speakers. First of all, Nicholas Allen. Nick Allen is the Baldwin Professor of Humanities and the Director of the Wilson Centre for Humanities and Arts at the University of Georgia. He was educated here at Queen's and holds a PhD in English from Trinity College Dublin. And Nick writes widely about Irish literature, the environmental and the blue humanities, and cultural history. His publications are numerous and wide-ranging and include monographs such as George Russell, A.E. and the New Ireland in 2003, and Ireland Literature and the Coast, Sea Tangled, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And he's edited numerous collections, including Coastal Works, Cultures of the Atlantic Edge, with Oxford in 2017. The anthology Archipelago, A Reader, with Lilliput Press in Dublin in 2021, and Cities of Belfast in 2003, and indeed also a selection of Ernie O'Malley's letters published in 2011. He's been the Burns Visiting Scholar at Boston College and has received many grants and awards, including from the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Irish Research Council. And his latest book, which has brought us here this afternoon, is Lough Neagh, published by Oxford University Press in January 2026. And Nick will be speaking to Mark Carruthers, or speaking with Mark Carruthers, who I'm sure many people know is one of Northern Ireland's most respected broadcasters. He joined the BBC in Northern Ireland in 1989 and currently presents a string of well-established political programmes on television and radio, including The View, Sunday Politics and Red Lines. And he's been nominated for 4 Royal Television Society Awards for his work. Mark is also a graduate of Queen's in political science with a master's awarded in 1989. And he received an honorary doctorate from Queen's in 2019 for distinction in broadcasting and is currently visiting professor of media at Ulster University. He's also himself an author and editor with Stephen Dowds of Stepping Stones, The Arts in Ulster, 1971 to 2001, published by Blackstaff, and Alternative Ulsters, Conversations on Identity, which was published by Liberties Press in 2013, and his latest book, Colin Davidson, 12 Paintings, Conversations with Mark Carruthers, was published by Merrion Press in November 2025. So it's a great pleasure to have both Nick and Mark here, and I hope you enjoy tonight's proceedings. I'll hand over to Mark, who will take things off.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Thank you for coming on. Just thinking Stephen Dowds and I stole the title Stepping Stones from Seamus, and then Seamus took it back, quite rightly so. But it's lovely to be here. It's lovely to be asked to just nudge this little conversation along with Nicholas. David's been selling copies of the book here, so I hope if you haven't seen the book already, and forgive me if I'm behind me here, a little bit difficult to see everybody at one time. If you haven't had a chance to look at the book, hopefully you'll be able to buy a copy, get it signed by Nicholas, and read it at your leisure. We'll give you a little flavour, I think, Nicholas, of the book, but we're not gonna talk through the book line by line. But it's interesting in so many ways. But I should say, by the way, we'll talk for about half an hour here, and then we'll take some questions from the floor. So you get an opportunity if you have a burning issue that you want to pick up on, or something that you think I've not touched on. Nicholas would be more than happy to to take whatever questions you might have. I suppose what struck me, and I know you're very keen to make the point about the book, that it's not in itself an academic book, although I think we were talking earlier and I said it has heft, but it wears it lightly. It's a very personal approach to the later work of Seamus Heaney. And I think it might be useful if you just maybe set out for people the concept, if you like, of why you approach the subject in this particular way, because there's a lot about Heaney in there, but there's a lot about how you have interacted with and how you view the work that Seamus produced in his 4 last collections.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm really grateful you're here to talk with me today. It's nice to see so many people I've known for such a long time here, and also people who've come to be part of the conversation. So thank you. I suppose the book is a meeting of many things in very short form. I've read Heaney for a very long time, and I'm very grateful that 2 of my teachers from school a very long time ago now, who left a great impression on me, Mr. Pattison and Mr. Ormsby, are here today, and some of my great teachers then from Queen's afterwards. I see Eamon here. And then people whose writing has meant a great deal to me. I see Anna is here, and words and ideas and thoughts and impressions that I've carried with me for a long time. And that, I think, intersected with a sense which was partly in my own life, and which I think is partly historical and contemporary, that we perhaps reached a point where all of those experiments in language we have had in writing, and all those thoughts and feelings we've had in painting, and Colin's beautiful images on the front of the book, and the great work that Colin has done, I think all of those things have precipitated perhaps a different sense of who and where we are in the North. And I haven't lived in the North for a long time, but I was reminded of it frequently during the last 10 years with the Brexit episode, the lack of value attached to the place, and that conversation about this place and its people, that I really felt that this moment of reflection combined with this history of reading and learning, and I think my own set of personal experiences, about which we can talk more, all came together in this book, in this reflection, in this gathering of thoughts and impressions about Heaney's writing. And I suppose too, in all those years of training, I had found different outlets for my writing. I've written many academic books. Of my first one, my uncle, who's been a wonderful champion and support, told me it was a great help if you couldn't sleep at night. But I thought, really, is there another way to communicate with people? And I write frequently, and I'm grateful to have done so, reviews in the Irish Times. And people would often write to me afterwards and say they enjoyed the reviews, aside from the book, under question. So that style developed too. So I suppose that depth of reading, the peculiarities of recent historical experience, trying to find a language that reflects the strange frequencies that I grew up in as a reader, and how all of those force fields, I think, connected with my feeling for Heaney, which is very deep and very long held.
So what it is not, obviously, and it doesn't set out to be, is in any way a kind of critical essay about all of the work in those 4 collections. So I think when we were chatting earlier, you said somebody else could approach this book in in the same way, but produce something entirely different. They could choose different themes, they could choose different poems to focus on. So that sort of thematic arranging is very important. And they sort of cross-reference, don't they? You can't have one without the other, it struck me.
Yeah, I sometimes think of writing as a musical, but about an arrangement of music, or a kind of architecture. And I think as I've gone on as a teacher and a writer myself, I've been less and less interested in making people understand something through arguments, as opposed to trying to make them feel something upon which they might reflect, and then think differently about how they read and how they experience reality through art. And art is a great work of ventriloquism and a great work of illusion to some degrees, but there are also, I think, portals of place in the greatest art that might take you to appreciate the everyday and the given and the neglected, and think of it in a different way than you ever have before. And I don't mean to embarrass you, but the very greatest works of art put into words things that you only previously knew as feelings. And I think that Heaney did that, and he didn't do it really through argument or composition or trying to make you think one thing or another, but I think he evoked a landscape and a weather and the light, which becomes very important in the later work, and I think that's one of the very surprising things about it. Often these are poems about mortality, but they're not at all dark. But within that sense of illumination, there is the possibility to see the places in which we live and relate to each other in a different and sometimes more generous and unexpected light than sometimes we've allowed ourselves. And I think, partly that story of becoming a reader during the troubles of this relative peace in which we now live, I think that that's all mediated in that texture of the book. And I suppose just one last thing to say, I was so grateful to Colin to share that image at the front, because I think that kind of chiaroscuro aspect to the, how would you say, the description of Heaney's character, the light and the dark, the fine marks, the sketch of an outline, the space in which you might find something of yourself in the image of someone else is, I think, very important to the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes for a really striking thought.
Sorry, Mark, can I just double check that your mic isn't
Oh,
on mute?
sorry. Well, I don't think
It is.
There you are.
that would be right. That would make a huge difference. You'd think I would know. It's a very fair point. Sorry about that. Now it sounds terribly loud. I'm happy to be dialed down a little bit. Anyway, the Colin lithograph, I think, works very, very well. And you do go on to talk about Colin's work in some detail in the book. I mean, maybe we should leave that for now, because I think that whole element is very interesting. But I wanted to deal with the nuts and bolts, first of all, about those three areas that you talk about in particular: landscape, bearings, and ghosts. And I suppose I wondered how you landed on those three areas. And then maybe we should say, or you should say something about each of them in turn. We can get onto the riverbank idea afterwards, but those three things are key to your approach.
Well, I think I wanted to find sequences that would make you feel something about the poems. I originally thought that I would do a very simple, typically academic thing, and that I would write a chapter about each book. But I did not love all the poems and all the books equally. It was very interesting when I came to organizing the rights for the book at the end, and you have to line by line adjudicate between which collection each poem's come up. It was interesting to see in the kind of graph where most of the poems came from, but I suppose it was a kind of work of editing that had gone on before, and what came out very clearly in that work of editing, or that work of sketching, if I could take that term, was that landscape was very important. Now, a surprising one. He, of course, spent much of his later life travelling, but really rooted and located in Dublin. But Dublin really doesn't feature very much in the book, although Wicklow does to a degree. And I may be the first Belfast man, as I said to you before, to have ever written a love letter to South Derry. I may be the last. But this kind of imminent landscape around Lough Neagh, between Toon and Balaki, those water margins became very important to the book. So that was a phase. And in one of the poems he mentions about taking bearings and having love as a stand. So I wanted, without writing a biography, to give a sense of his emotional and his social coordinates. And so I really look at the poems in which other poets, visual artists, and friends appeared, to give you a kind of map of some of the social relations that appeared in the poetry. And this led me then to this other phase that fits into later on, which I think is really quite remarkable, which is the idea of ghosts. Now, we tend to think of ghosts as being hauntings, as unresolved things, but in Heaney they come almost like premonitions, that they are things that are with us. And some of the wonderful poems, remember, he himself becomes ghostly. And I think that this is actually one of the interesting things about the book, is that late Heaney is not a difference from early Heaney in substance or even necessity and style, but it's ideas and forms and words and apparitions that he was familiar with, that he had worked with deeply, that become different in shape and form in the later books. And the image I have in my own head is a piece of stone worn so thin that the light begins to shine through it differently than whatever aesthetic than it did before. So there's a strange watery light that is, I think, in keeping with his fascination with these waterlands around Lough Neagh, with Moyola, with Lough Neagh, with the riverbank, with the riverbank field. And I think that that sense, you can well imagine here, I mean, in the couple of weeks, whenever the rain finally stops, and you get those sort of liquid days of sun through cloud, where the sun's not strong enough to really make you feel its presence on your face, but it gives a certain sense of brightness that is almost of a lateness of a late afternoon. And I think that there's a lot of that in these later writing.
And obviously we know he left South Derry as a young man. He went to Belfast. he went to Dublin and then he was recognized and traveled internationally. But what you're saying is that both in his work and physically, he himself, he keeps going back to that landscape and drawing on it.
Yeah, well, the comparison I made at the start of the book is that it's, I mean, it almost seems like a slightly crazed thing to say, but it's, you know, between Toome and the Lough is the Heaney as Grasmere is to Wordsworth, that there is a kind of lake district, and it is a lake or a loch district in Heaney's writing. So I think he goes back to those places frequently, walks through them, works through them, and there is that cyclical sense that they are an end and a beginning, that there is a constant sense of process in the work. And I think that that's also unusual too. There's one version of lateness, which is this mad final ninth symphony finale, where everything gets thrown out in a kind of crazed anger. There's not any of that raging in Heaney's poems, but there is a kind of steady working through. And if there is a kind of letting go, I think it's more letting go into light, into premonition, into a ghostliness that's not haunted because it is populous. And I suppose the other part of this social work of Heaney's poetry is the fact that it remains, as it always was, populated by many voices. It just happens to be that later on, so many of the voices are not those of the living. And I think that's again where the connection to Virgil is so strong through the book. And I think slightly whenever I pick the book up and see the way they've cropped the cover, that Seamus almost has that Roman hair at the front. He has a slightly Virgilian hair.
Do you think he consciously, do you see evidence in the work that you're focusing on of him consciously seeing that place where he grew up differently as he matured as a poet and grew older as a man?
I use the word conscious. I mean, of all of ourselves, we see and experience things differently as we age, and will continue to do so until we no longer can. So I would say the idea of the river is very important. And maybe a roundabout way of answering your question is to think about the ecology of the landscape. So if you were to follow how Lough Neagh and the Moyola were represented through the poems, I think you get to see a sense of change. And I think one of his great poetic breakthroughs is the poem The Strand at Lough Neagh, that last collection. Fieldwork of 1979, of the later 1970s, is really, I think, where he really came into himself as a poet, at least for me. And that, I think, there you could see the moderation of memory, of rebuke, of a call for justice, of a certain kind of visibility, of a fully imagined environment and weather. And I think that that continues to grow and change as he goes on. So I think there are several phases. They're not all to do with age, but again, these intersection of interests, historical moments, and returns. And I suppose one person to think about in this book, in all the books I've written, I've realized I have these ghost figures myself. When I wrote my little book about modernism and the Irish Civil War, Ernie O'Malley was a kind of fugitive figure in the background there. And in this book, you'll read about Sean Brown, who was murdered from the Lough from the GAA club. And when he went to Greece a second time after he won the Nobel Prize, his Sonnets from Hellas, he remembers Sean Brown. And this book remembers Sean Brown. It's remarkable that so many of Heaney's poems from the 70s about people who were murdered, or about people who were murdered and still have never received justice or their families' proper memory. So without making a statement, the book, I think, creates a kind of porous surface between these places, these rivers and landscapes, and these people who were there, and their motions and motivations and their histories. It makes visible, I think, and keeps in mind all of those mingled histories in which he lived.
And in terms of the politics of it, I mean, the overt politics of his later poetry, do you think that he was conscious of having to walk a particular tightrope?
Well, I think he was very much, I didn't mean to speak for him, so I'm just using this in my own language to speak of how I might have felt such a thing, but I think he great sense of curtailment in the early work. And then I think that's where a collection, for me at least, like North, and there was a wonderful conference here about the 50th anniversary of North just last summer, where North goes wrong in a way, because it is curtailed. It's written in forms that are too sturdy. They don't allow for that transparency or emotion. And if you're wondering really what I'm talking about, when you go to the end of the strand at Lough Neagh, which is for Colin McCartney, the imagination is that the body is washed with dew and rainwater, and the loch becomes a kind of living, imminent feature. So I think having that kind of immersed, fluid language became for Heaney a way of keeping things visible and memorialized without allowing them to be fixed in one way or another. And I think it's also an invitation for us to think about in our own lives and memories how that flow can continue, how we might find a deeper generosity or connection yet. And to me, that's one of the reasons why to keep the read the poems. But it's different from saying you should do something, or we could be better, or we might be better. It's to say that there are conditions in which we could live that could give us all a more generous sense of the possibility of life, while never forgetting all of those people who are not allowed to have that life. I think that that's a critical reminder.
One of the things that you touch on in the book, and I wonder if you think that Seamus was particularly aware of it himself, and if it shaped what he did and how he did it, is the idea that he wrote his poetry, well, you say really for all of his professional life in the public spotlight, but obviously that increased as he became more and more successful. And you're focusing on the period after 1995 when he won the Nobel Prize in literature. Do you think that was a real burden? Do you see evidence of that being a burden? In a sense, he kept raising the bar for himself.
Yeah, I don't know if poetry works like that. You know, I don't know if it's that kind of accumulation. And I think maybe that riverine wandering deltaic version of art is more appropriate to it. So I know there was the joke that it's kind of like the Nobel bother, and the way that it becomes something aside from yourself, but he had been like that for a long time. There's a wonderful photograph of him at the launch with Faber of North, and behind him are photographs of himself. He was always already in a kind of hall of mirrors where versions of himself were continually projected upon him. One of the most touching letters, I think, in the selected letters that he writing to the mother of a young woman who he had apparently offended by not giving her enough attention at the book launch. And the mother had written to rebuke him, and Seamus took the time to write back. So I think this sense of being under observation was long familiar to him. But I think too, and maybe this is where the South Derry landscape was so rewarding for him, that in his inner self, as I understand it from reading the poems, that point of intimate observation is a point of reserve. And I do think that, you know, one of his great gifts was to be sociable in public without being known. We call him Seamus, you know, in a way that maybe you don't call Wordsworth William. So there is, and I wonder how that will go over time. You know, I wonder how that sense of intimate impression will last. So there is a kind of skill in hiding in plain sight. I don't know the effect that you could say it had on writing the poems particularly, but I think there are some very great poems in the later books that are there aside from, in spite of, with no relation to being a gilded international poet or Nobel laureate. And I think they're fundamental in a very human way. That it's taken me a long time to see it doesn't need qualification by context. It doesn't need critical argument way. If you can create the setting in this hall of mirrors in which we all live that shows some particular light in these poems that he created, I think that that's an important and profound thing.
Yeah, and I mean, you're quite interesting. You're very interesting about the sociability of the man and the pressures that put upon him, because there were so many people asking him to do so many things, and I think he found it hard, or it seems that he found it hard to say no. So, and towards the end of the book, I think it's in the afterwards, you say he was known in part by many people, but unknown in substance to any but his family and very closest friends. I think the interesting thing is a lot of people maybe felt that they knew Seamus Heaney, maybe felt that because they had had some dealings with him, that they knew him. But what you're saying is that they knew a little bit of him, but they didn't really know.
That's a kind of critical self-rebuke too. I mean, I don't assume to know, but I hope I have orchestrated a landscape and setting and a set of connections, and also a kind of vocabulary for reading that might allow each of you in your own way with your own love of feeling, which will be particular to you, to find the deepening of that love, to find a different perspective. Or even I hope other people who read in other places who know nothing of Belfast and Little of Heaney might find something in this book that resonates with them that they could take off to another literature, another time and place altogether. It's a very interesting time to think about Seamus because, you know, so well known, so generous, such a generous and welcoming family too, been very kind to me. But I'm very conscious again of this generation I grew up in, which already is passing. It once seemed like it would last forever, but will not. But you know, who knows? Others will look back in 50 years or 100 years or 150 years when they finally build the 3-lane motorway through the middle of the Heaney country. So at least there is a little testimony there to really being in this time and place. And I think that seems true to the tenor of the literature too.
Yes. Well, the motorway might come, the dual carriageway has certainly cut through, and I suppose there's a debate, isn't there? as to-
Every time I see it.
Do you? Yeah, I mean, I don't live there, so I don't know, but I drive along that road very often, going back to Lough Neagh, where my mother lives, and to me, it doesn't seem as if it's changed the landscape, but then you wouldn't think that if you're driving at 60 miles an hour on a dual carriageway, but you'd only know that presumably if you live there.
But you know, it's such a fascinating thing, at least to me. You know, I walk out there quite a lot, and that sense of sonic proximity of the road definitely changes the place. But at the same time, I use that road frequently, and I'm grateful for it, having travelled many years without it. But I suppose, in the broader sense, the road aside, I hope the book contributes to some idea of value of the place. I know the people who live there value it deeply, and I'm grateful that someone from the outside have come in and, in an almost ritualistic like way, just because I'm an academic, I come back in the summers, I return to it over and over again. It has been a coincidence. It's like something I think in Heaney's own writing, and Lough Neagh, a repetition of ritual of the known thing. And I think I've come to see it in different aspects than you might read just to travel it, to get something from it or to see something from it. And I hope that that kind of lambent about the landscape comes through the book, because it is a deep love and affection. It is a very special place. And I don't think we've often thought about Lough Neagh and all its dimensions as we might. It's the kind of forgotten heart of the north, as you can see from how we treat it ecologically. But that waterland around Toom, leading out into the lower stretches of the upper down, it's a remarkable place.
Where are you on the issue of nostalgia in terms of those final 4 collections? Do you think that as Seamus got older, as he became increasingly frail, that he thought about the past and his early days and thought about his legacy and his place in the canon of Irish poetry? Was that all?
Yeah, I don't really. It's not a thought that's in the book, because I think the thought of the book is about process and working and reflection as an activity.
Yeah.
So to me, poetry is not a record of that which has been, but is a kind of premonition, a working through towards language of what might yet be. And of course, the greatest question that none of us can answer until we experience it, and then we have no language to share, is what happens at the end of our life and after, if anything happens at all. And so Heaney's language of light and weather, I think, is almost a looking over the horizon in that sense. And I think that's where that fascination with Virgil and the Aeneid. And that underworld is not a dark place. It's an unexpected place with many further connections again. That's in the book. And so again, if there's a sort of presiding idea in the background, I suppose it's more not at all of nostalgia of the past, but of the past is taking future forms always. So this remaking of the work of art. I mean, not to call and Colin again, I don't mean to embarrass you, but Colin does a beautiful and remarkable and utterly different painting of Belfast every year.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a work of return, which is to create a portal towards, it's kind of a testimony, but it's also an invocation. And I think the best of the poetry works like that. Now, not all the poems are great at the end, and some were repetitious, but they're not another.
Yeah. Well, people might want to ask you about that in a bit more detail. I don't know how hard people want to go in on that particular thing, but can I ask you, do you think there are some poems that might maybe not have been included in some of those collections?
You always, I mean, and who am I to say, but I mean, it is the work of the critic to be critical, and I think there's some affectations from 19th century English poetry and also from Anglo-Saxon poetry. And I share a love of Beowulf. I had a great Beowulf teacher here. I studied Anglo-Saxon as it was all the way through my undergraduate career, such as it was. But I think, yeah, I mean, the books are uneven. I think Electric Light is really remarkable. I think District and Circle is fabulous. And I think they're great poems in Green and Sheen. And The Spirit Level also some great poems, but I don't think they're even. But I think probably we used to look at any poet's collection. Would you think they were all evenly placed? I think it's impossible. So I think again, that idea of these being some sketches, some fully worked works of art, and then again, different poems live at different times. Poems wait. The poems that we like now or that speak to us now may not be the ones that speak in 20, 30 years. There are plenty of poems like Active Union from Heaney's earlier career that really have not worn well at all. So again, this is not just a late work, it's the fact that editing always continues.
Yeah, you mentioned Colin a couple of times, and I know you're interested in the notion of the sort of connectedness or the interconnectedness between literature and the visual arts, for example. And I think one of the lovely stories about Colin's work and Seamus Heaney is the fact that Colin has talked about this, but Colin painted the last portrait of Seamus, and the Queen's connection is an interesting one because Colin's exhibition in 2013 had that portrait unveiled in it, and it took place. Well, Seamus never got to see it at the Norton Gallery because, unfortunately, the opening happened the night before his funeral. But we do know that he loved the portrait, which I think says something about his generosity as well. Because Michael Lumley told a story about Seamus having a photograph of the portrait on his phone when being at a summer school and showing everybody the portrait, and how much he loved it and how proud he was of it, which is obviously lovely for Colin. But it also says something about Seamus, I think, doesn't it?
Well, I think about the fact that you would still be moved by such a thing, that you would be touched by it, says that there's a movement still there, which I think is necessary. I mean, it's so very interesting with different stories and thoughts, just to go back a little bit to, thinking about which version of place and life and memories there, and also like the proximity of the people who know and love you, and a different kind of story. But when I'm very conscious in this book that Seamus was also a father, that he was a husband, that he was a family member, a brother, a neighbour, all of those love things. I was in Malakia the weekend, and it was lovely to be there amongst people that knew him well. But I had given a version of this talk before the book was ever published in Dublin, and Mary was there, and she sat, at the front of the room. And I thought, I was very conscious, naturally, of the human dimension of things. But she was really wonderful, and she invited me to the house next day. We had a great morning of conversation. And the house is on Sandymount Strand. You have the beautiful aspect of the beach before you. You can imagine, actually, that big panorama of light over Dublin Bay might have worked away into these South Derry poems surreptitiously. I said, that's wonderful. Seamus must have been so delighted that he could just walk out the door and take to the beach and have all of this, the fresh air and everything there. And she laughed and she said, well, Seamus and Derek Mahon, used to call it the great indoors. And so there is also, a version of these poems which are about these places, and they're known, but of course they're known in the imagination as the imagination makes them. And I think it's beautiful that Seamus saw something of himself in that portrait. And I think it's also appropriate that this sketch is on the cover of the book because it is a kind of modesty. This is a small version of the world as it might be through Heaney's late poems, but it's also both a stripping back and a revelation of a layer of things that otherwise might go unremarked.
I'm going to open it up to the floor, but just as a contribution to our broader understanding of Seamus Heaney, the person, and the work of Seamus Heaney, well, the book's been very well received. I'm not going to ask you to criticise your own book or to critique your own book, but I mean, you must be pleased that you're part of that conversation and that the book, when it's a beautifully produced book, anybody who's seen it will realise very quickly. That's something that's been that's something that just must give you a lot of pleasure. I mean, you were at Seamus Heaney home place on Saturday.
I have to say, I mean, the funny thing about this book, I mean, I've had many sleepless nights thinking, oh my God, did I get that wrong? Or did I say this? Is that right? So unusually for a book like this, you think of an academic as doing something and finishing it, but this goes out into the world without its scholarly protection in a way. But I was in St Andrews last week, and a good friend of mine introduced it, saying to me, did you get Oxford to do that? That's not scholarly book at all. I thought, well, so in a sense, the and I'll come back to the idea of being pleased or not, but the critical perception of the thing is in the assumption of a language. It's from the point from which the person looks. I have a great fascination with Jack Yeats, and I was always fascinated in his paintings, how much he could tell from the place that he chose to paint from, as much as the thing that he was painting. This is true of his great painting, What the Liffey Swim. So, in a sense, the book's form and style is very important, and if I'm pleased with anything, it's not simply the fact that someone would tell me that it's readable, which could mean any number of things, but that hopefully, and there's a beautiful epigram from Lough at the start of it, which I think says everything about the book, that it has been compacted in such a way that you can access it, read it, understand it, be present with it, in a way that might also you encourage to have your own thoughts and for you to keep going back.
Mhm.
Where did you end? And I think that the Nobel allowed me a sort of dramatic introduction of change. And in the end, actually, the book is not really about change. It's about a deepening and a wearing. But it allowed me that point where things publicly became different. And I suppose to go back to your question, Mark, about how things changed, to allow that as the stage in which all of these players that enters life after makes some sense. I suppose the idea of lateness just seemed a great way to think about. There's so much about Heaney in the 70s, and that becomes a kind of overwhelming part, along with Heaney digging in Wellingtons. And I wanted to give a significant phrase to the reader to think that they were in a different space. I don't think that mortality is necessarily measured in years in that sense, and some of the great poems about aging and death have been written by younger people. I'm not sure that there's a right amount of time that any of us are allowed to live, but I think that there is definitely, and it's very striking just at the end of Heaney's life, and this is going to be the ghostliness and the riverbank field part of it, that there is an imminence, there is an awareness of the body feeling, and that great description he has of trying to walk himself in physiotherapy along that wooden handles of the supports, and imagining that bumpiness as being like the bumpiness of the stones in the charioteer. So I mean, he's aware of these things. And I think what fascinated me with me was that, again, as I said earlier, it's not that wild madness of late work that you associate with Beethoven or the things that Said has described. But it's not a giving in either, although giving in would be fun. However one wants to do these things is however one does it. But I think there is a kind of music and illumination in the later poems that is of a different quality than the earlier. And partly that's to do with their chronology and that self-awareness of the body not quite lasting. And maybe one of the poems to answer this reader, think about it afterwards, this idea of district and circle, strapped in, packed in, into the dark. And what have been the waterlands of Lough Neagh that I've been talking about becomes the sweat and the water dripping off the caverns and the underground tunnels. And yet there also is then this idea, this sibilant English of coming back up again. He ends up in strange places, but you're taken on all these kinds of journeys into the unknown, I think. So one other thing I would say that there is different, it's very striking in Nobel's speech. One of the things he says is that I decided it was time to look up. So much of the Heaney you can imagine digging and looking down and down, down and down, that he wanted to release himself from that way. So there is a kind of oddly like a kind of a backstrip in the whole thing. And I think also, and I write about this in the book, there's a different horizon to the work. It's not enough further away. It's not foreshortened. It's not all that kind of closeness that you associate with proximity. And if you wanted to think about this as you went through Heaney after, I think that kind of murmuring world that he lived in, frequencies of which he picked up on the radio as a child, that I think which lived there before, that's the kind of extended sonic and the tree landscape in which he lived. And I think that that comes back very much in the later things too. And again, that great riverbank field poem, you know, he's walking along by the river, he's thinking about the local townlands. And he says, you know, I'm going to write this again one more time. So there is always that kind of return.
Thank you very much. There would be time for one more question, I think, to bring us to full hour. Here we go.
Not so much a question, but maybe a comment. One of the things that you mentioned was that your friend said that it wasn't a very scholarly book because perhaps it wasn't a huge tome. It's a neat little book if you used to, but it's full of so much because while you've got all the reflections about Heaney's poems, there's also how other poets have influenced him. And I thought I could sort of skim read it, but you can't skim read it. You have to read each sentence, each paragraph. And it feels like fireworks are going off because you think, oh yes, you've mentioned Louis MacNeice, you've mentioned Frank Ormsby, people that have been so important to Heaney in different ways. So that's all the comment I just wanted to say.
That's very kind of you. Thank you very much. And thank you too. I joke, but I am really grateful for the close reading, and I suppose I hope it will all become clear to you over time. And thank you too, Mark. I have admired this too. In fact, I did my little homage to you myself.
That's very nice.
I appreciate you taking the time. And did you say you, if you apply something, I'd be very grateful. And, you know, the other people I want to thank, my parents are here tonight. And, yeah, well. The people who encouraged and subvented my wild ride through Queen's University Belfast, so thank you.
On lovers of air, and listen not to me, till I relate these verses to thee. Are concerned of a clever youth who was cut down in his prime, and who died upon the gallows to the bridge of Toon. I hear speak from the tall street. I clung to the lofty poplar. His body was complete. His growth was like the tufted fern that does ascend the hill and wave his shoulder. The locks on yellow hair in sweet drum in this youthful praise of time. His parents said to pay by the river stream. For day and night they sorely toil, all for the family, till destination. By curse and perjury was washed father's life. Secondly, his mother told her, but she says, I am done. They took from me my property, my houses and my land, and in the parish I there. Farewell to you, sweet will I stay on the dearly, we never can betray. The gallows tree I'd never see, and I remain there for doth you betray. Set the snake, body scorn was betrayed. Swore me I defend our foe to the crown, which caused young Roddy for to live beneath the spreading thorn. Oh, he'd sigh and say, alas, the day that I he was conveyed by nature, floated there with silence. His bed was that cold ground, and he was with up there, a scaffold to ascend. He looked at the loving friend, said, "Faithless friend, I won't down, listen, since 'tis upon Good Friday, I'll execute thee, conveyed to the bridge of two. Colors three, he called on Father John, his very scarce sweet. Here is all one of Christ's soul, the shepherd's porch of feet. Ah, my
very much. And thank you to Yansha and Peter and everybody else involved in organising. I much appreciate it. Thank you to Nicholas. And the lullabies are there. With copies of the book at a special price. Don't tell us the university price, but 18 pounds, but you haven't got one yet. Very welcome. And Nicholas is going to stick around and have a glass of wine and sign books for anybody who wants. Okay. So thank you very much.